The delivery of food assistance shifted from distributing actual goods to transferring purchasing power. It became routine, a technical upgrade woven into the retail environment. The full effects of this integration took years to materialize. This was not an isolated change, but a single move in a much larger restructuring. The shift wasn't announced. There were no public hearings about it. It simply became the new standard, implemented through a series of administrative decisions that most people never heard about. What replaced the previous system wasn't designed to be reversed. It was designed to scale. The change involved how food assistance worked at the federal level. For nearly 4 decades, the government had distributed actual commodities, blocks of cheese, canned goods, powdered milk, flour, physical food, purchased in bulk, stored in warehouses, delivered to distribution centers. It was inefficient by modern standards, it was costly to maintain, but it represented a direct relationship between government surplus and public need. That system was phased out, gradually, and replaced with something that looked more convenient, something that required less infrastructure, something that worked through existing retail channels instead of creating parallel ones. The new system used vouchers, then stamps, then cards. It integrated with supermarkets rather than competing with them, and in doing so, it fundamentally altered what food assistance meant. The government was no longer in the business of providing food, it was providing purchasing power. That distinction seemed minor at the time, administrative even. Most people didn't question it. It blended into everyday life. The transition happened city by city, county by county, over several years. By the time it was complete, the old system had been entirely dismantled. The warehouses were sold, the distribution networks were closed. There was no going back because the infrastructure to go back to no longer existed. What made this transition possible was trust. Trust that private markets would always stock what people needed. Trust that competition would keep prices reasonable. Trust that the same stores serving everyone else could serve the most vulnerable without friction. These assumptions were rarely examined. They were treated as self-evident. The new system was more modern, more efficient, more dignified than standing in line at a government warehouse. That's how it was presented. That's how it was received. Most people never noticed this at the time. It wasn't discussed in daily conversation. It seemed like a technical improvement in government administration, not a fundamental restructuring of the social contract around food. The scope of what had shifted only becomes clear when you trace what happened next. The real impact appeared years later, not immediately. The first generation to grow up entirely under the new system experienced it as normal. They had no memory of the old commodity distribution. To them, food assistance had always meant navigating a supermarket with restricted purchasing power, not receiving actual provisions. This created a different relationship with food security. Under the old system, you received what was available, often surplus items the government had purchased to stabilize agricultural markets. Under the new system, you were given money to spend, but you were making choices in the same environment as everyone else. Same products, same marketing, same engineered palatability, same incentive structures designed to maximize profit per square foot of shelf space. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. Children who received food assistance in the 1980s and 1990s grew up in supermarkets that had transformed dramatically from what they'd been in the 1960s. The percentage of shelf space devoted to processed foods had expanded. Fresh produce sections, where they existed at all in lower-income neighborhoods, were often smaller and less maintained than in wealthier areas. The products that offered the most calories per dollar were the products with the longest ingredient lists. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of decades of agricultural policy, food science innovation, and retail optimization. The new assistance system didn't create these conditions, but it did make recipients fully dependent on them. What's rarely mentioned is how this tied into larger economic restructuring happening simultaneously. The 1970s marked the beginning of wage stagnation for most American workers. The dismantling of commodity food distribution happened at the same moment that real wages stopped growing. As more families needed assistance, the system they entered was one that channeled them into the same retail environment where processed food was rapidly displacing whole food. There was no separate supply chain for food assistance recipients, no different set of products, no alternative food economy. Everyone, regardless of income, was now navigating the same system, a system designed for profit, not nutrition. This wasn't about individual choices. The framing around food assistance has always included heavy emphasis on personal responsibility, budgeting skills, smart shopping. But those frameworks ignore the structural reality. When you allocate a fixed amount of money to someone and tell them to feed their family in an environment where the cheapest calories come from ultra-processed foods engineered for overconsumption, you're not testing their decision-making ability. You're testing the limits of their options within a constrained system. The assumption was that markets, left to operate freely, would provide what people needed at prices they could afford. That assumption proved incorrect, but by the time the evidence accumulated, the alternative infrastructure was gone. You cannot return to a system that no longer exists. The commodity warehouses were sold decades ago. The distribution networks were disbanded. The agricultural purchasing programs that created those surpluses were restructured. Even if there were political will to reverse course, and there isn't, the physical capacity to do so has been eliminated. This created a form of dependence that's different from earlier models of food assistance. Under commodity distribution, the government acted as a purchaser and distributor. Under the voucher system, it acts as a subsidy to private retail. SNAP benefits, the program that replaced food stamps, now represents one of the largest subsidies to the grocery industry. Walmart is the single largest recipient of SNAP dollars. It's not because recipients prefer Walmart, it's because Walmart has systematically eliminated competition in low-income areas, and because their pricing structure makes them the most efficient option when resources are limited. The program designed to help people eat has become a mechanism for funneling public money into private corporations. None of this was secret. It was documented, studied, written about in policy journals, but it remained largely outside public discourse. The focus stayed on individual recipients, whether they were deserving, whether they were making good choices, whether the program was being abused. Those questions dominated. The structural questions didn't. How did we get to a place where the cheapest food is the least nutritious? Why did we dismantle a system that provided actual food in favor of one that provides purchasing power in a dysfunctional market? What happens when you make the most vulnerable population entirely dependent on a profit-driven food system? There's a term in economics, path dependence. It means that decisions made early in a process constrain all future options. The choice to eliminate commodity food distribution and replace it with retail vouchers created path dependence. It locked us into a specific trajectory. Every subsequent policy decision has been made within that framework. Proposals to improve food assistance now involve things like incentivizing fruit and vegetable purchases, restricting certain categories of food, or increasing benefit amounts. None of these address the underlying problem, that we've made people dependent on a food system designed to maximize profit, not health. The children who grew up under this system are adults now. Many of them are raising their own children within it. The generational impact is measurable. Patterns of diet-related disease, patterns of food insecurity despite living in a country with massive food surpluses, patterns of corporate consolidation in food retail. These aren't separate issues, They're connected through policy decisions made 50 years ago that seemed, at the time, like straightforward administrative improvements. What replaced real food didn't arrive overnight. It was introduced gradually through mechanisms that appeared rational and modern. Efficiency was the justification, dignity was the rhetoric. The reality was a transfer of control from public systems, however imperfect, to private markets that operate according to very different incentives. We are living with the consequences of that transfer now, and the infrastructure to reverse it no longer exists. The people who made these decisions weren't thinking about what food would look like in 2025. They were solving immediate problems: storage costs, distribution logistics, administrative complexity. They were responding to pressure from agricultural interests, retail lobbies, and budget hawks. They were operating within an ideological framework that assumed markets would self-correct, that competition would protect consumers, that economic growth would lift all boats. Those assumptions shaped the architecture of how America feeds its most vulnerable citizens. Perhaps you remember the exact texture of government cheese, or perhaps you only know food assistance as a card that works like any other payment method at checkout. That difference between receiving provisions and receiving purchasing power defines more than just logistics. It defines the relationship between public responsibility and private profit. It defines who controls the food system and in whose interest it operates. Similar decisions followed. The pattern of replacing direct provision with market-based vouchers spread to other forms of assistance: housing vouchers instead of public housing, private insurance subsidies instead of direct health care. The logic was always the same. Markets are more efficient. Choice is more dignified. Government provision is outdated. Each time, the infrastructure for direct provision was dismantled. Each time, the path back was closed. Each time, the most vulnerable populations were integrated into systems designed for profit, not for them. And this wasn't the only change.